Are the meeting platform hosts ready to begin?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, are you ready to begin the meeting?
I am.
Please provide a 5-second countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good morning. I call this meeting to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. And while we wait for a quorum, we're going to get started. And pursuant to Rule 4, House Rule 11, Clause 2H4, the chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote, whether yeas or nays, are ordered. The committee procedures for remote hearings remain the same. If you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff connect our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veterans.hearings@mail.house.gov. That's veterans.hearings@mail.house.gov. Previously unfiled amendments should be submitted there as well. Does any member have a question about the procedure for today's meeting? Hearing none, we'll move on. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I wanted to set aside some time to begin discussion about the committee's rule for facility naming bills. A memo was sent out to members outlining some of the issues we've identified this Congress, and I would like to elicit feedback about those issues and any other naming bill related concerns members may have. I will open up the floor briefly for any discussion, but we've also sent around a feedback form that members can fill out and return to the committee if they wish. I will add that we received additional information from VA last night and have identified 2 additional cemeteries named after individuals. In the memo, we noted the Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery in Illinois, but there's also the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Kentucky and the Gerald B. H. Solomon National Cemetery in New York. The Taylor Cemetery appears to have carried that name from its purchase by the U.S. government from the Taylor family in 1928. It contains the gravesite of the former president. The Solomon National Cemetery is was named by Act of Congress in 2002. Does any member wish to be heard on the issue of VA facility naming? Mr. Ranking Member.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to have the conversation about VA facility naming bill criteria today. Our existing criteria for naming bills has been in place since 1998. I think the existing criteria are pretty good criteria. It prioritized local support for naming proposals in form of both delegation and local VSO support. It also allows the flexibility by allowing the chair and ranking member to waive the rules if they agree that there is a valid reason to do so. There have been only a few instances, I think, recently and in recent years that the criteria presented an issue. In each of those instances, we were able to work together to overcome those issues. If any changes to the existing criteria are warranted, it would probably be that the criteria would be more like the Senate VA committee criteria, and we would do that by requiring Senate delegations to signal their support in a letter rather than a VA via co-sponsorship of a naming bill. So they just send a letter rather than having to be co-sponsor of the bill. But that said, hey, I'm interested in hearing feedback from all the other members on the subject so that we can take it into consideration. And when we adopt naming criteria in our committee rules at the start of the next Congress, we'd love to hear about what everybody wants.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Really, this is a good opportunity for me to tout a bill that I just introduced. I think that we have an incredible amount of work looking at our agenda today to address the health and safety and welfare of our veterans. That's what we were sent here to do. And when it comes to naming facilities, I think that there's far too much time consumed by Congress trying to make determinations about the validity of someone having a building or a facility named after them. And that's why I introduced the Post Act, which is addressing only the United States Post Office facilities, so that we can turn that authority over to the state legislatures, which are much closer to those buildings, which their communities have much more in-depth knowledge and intimate knowledge about the individuals that would thereby be named those facilities after, and allows Congress to do the much more important work of developing budgets and providing oversight to the dollars that the taxpayers send up here. And so I would much rather see those decisions turned over to the local communities. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. And Mr. Roy?
Yeah, I thank the chairman. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I do want to echo a little bit of the sentiments of my friend from Montana. It does strike me that I can't tell you how many dozens, hundreds maybe, of conversations on the floor of the United States House of Representatives about the namings of buildings. And, you know, it strikes me as odd when we're $30.5 trillion in debt, when we have veterans who are, you know, struggling to figure out how they're going to get health care, when we're trying to figure out how to get community care to work, when we've got borders that are wide open, when we've got all of these things that we're dealing with. And people say, oh, well, you know, Congressman Roy, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, no, we can't. We really can't. And so I realize this is we'll get on to the business of the day, and it'd be somewhat ironic if I sit here and spend 5 minutes talking about it. But I can't really overstate to the people out there and the constituents out there listening to all this how many more conversations I've had about the namings of buildings than I have about the fundamental issues of the day. So, you know, we'll look at whatever the rules changes are, but I really do. I'm going to look at Mr. Rosendale's bill, but for the love of everything holy, can we just focus on solving the problems for the American people? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Roy, in that spirit, that is why I did not intend a long conversation. I provided forms for every member to submit their written comments. We've sent a memo outlining the issues that we've incurred, and I didn't think it warranted a huge discussion. But your point, I hear where you're all coming from, and I agree. We should spend a lot more time, our energy, on the trillions of dollars that we are shepherding and overseeing the second largest government department, second only to the Department of Defense. So we have a huge, huge responsibility. So I want to, any other comments coming from members? I want to thank you. I want to thank both gentlemen and the ranking member for the comments they've given so far. If you have additional views, please send those to the email I've noted before, veterans.hearings@mail.house.gov. We will now proceed to the markup portion of today's proceedings. I understand that we do have a quorum present. We have 13 bills on the agenda today, so in the interest of time, I'll forego a statement and save my remarks for individual measures. And I now recognize the ranking member for any remarks he may have.
I will go ahead and proceed with my opening remarks. We still are one short on a quorum. But
Are we?
Yeah, we are. But I think we can go ahead as long as we don't start taking up business and just overview of what the business is we're going to be dealing with today. And Chairman, thank you for recognizing me. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. You know, we're going to consider 13 bills as soon as we get to quorum, and many of them are bipartisan. The PACT Act is historically accomplished, but we have important work to do. We have legislation today to improve a whole range of VA services and benefits, including mental health, education, life insurance, and outreach. I will be supporting 7 of these bills, and I would like to be able to support more of them. Unfortunately, we have some serious problems, and it is going to paralyze this committee and make it tougher to serve veterans if we don't solve it. And well, that's because the changes that the Senate made to the Toxic Exposure Fund, or in the PACT Act, it is making new legislation much more expensive for taxpayers. Because of the fund, what used to be discretionary costs are now mandatory, and CBOs must add millions or even billions of dollars to their bill estimates. We just saw this with the extenders bill. Congress passed it every few years to continue a wide range of important VA programs that would otherwise expire. Now, we have never had any problem doing so. However, this year, CBO initially scored the extenders at over $1.1 billion in mandatory cost. That said, after some intervention by the Budget Committee and CBO reconsidered and concluded it's too early to score the extenders bills this way. But the CBO warned us that every future extenders bill will be much more expensive. The budget gimmicks in the Toxic Exposure Fund are already creating a serious obstacle to advancing many of the bills this committee is responsible for, including some of those we will consider today. It is our responsibility to the taxpayers to pay for our offsets and new programs we are creating. That gets a whole lot harder when many of our programs cost multiply because of some budgetary voodoo that was cooked up behind closed doors over in the Senate. Mr. Chairman, I'll be putting forward an amendment to solve this problem. I would it would revert the Toxic Exposure Fund back to its original version that you wrote and that the House passed. My amendment would not cut, let me say this again, would not cut the toxic exposure funding in any way. In fact, CBO has confirmed it would not affect the $500 million that has already been appropriated into the fund, and it would not limit the amount of funding that can be appropriated into the fund in the future. My amendment would simply reinstate normal cost estimates and scoring rules. I look forward to explaining my amendment further when the impacted bills come up. And with Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is that 15?
We now have, Miller Meeks is in the room. So
Okay.
No, he's sitting right. Yeah, he's just leaning back in his chair.
Mr. Elzey, please sit up in your chair.
Sit up in class.
Okay. That was a good one, Mr. Elzey. All right.
Okay, we're ready.
Thank you. So thank you, Ranking Member Bost. We'll now move to consideration of the bills on our agenda. I'll now call up H.R. 6273. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6273 to direct the
Text
Secretary of
circulated in
Veterans.
advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. There is compelling evidence that a specific integrated approach to suicide prevention and healthcare systems known as zero suicide can lead to significant drops in the rate of suicide among patients. This committee held a hearing last Congress with experts from the Zero Suicide Institute, and I applaud Congresswoman Lee for drafting this bill to implement zero suicide as a pilot program for VA in 5 medical centers. VA is a leader in taking a holistic approach, a holistic public health approach to veteran suicide that incorporates many components of the zero suicide program. It is still worth comparing whether a zero suicide program can add even more preventive value to VA's existing efforts. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Is there further debate on H.R. 6273?
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
I have an amendment if that.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Text was
62.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules without objection. The reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Bost, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you,
Support your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would remove the budget gimmick that the Senate added in the Toxic Exposure Fund in the PACT Act. Mr. Chairman, it would revert the fund's language back to its original version that you wrote and the House passed. It would eliminate the mandatory costs for this very important suicide prevention bill and eliminate these costs for all other bills on today's agenda that are similarly affected, as well as future bills. My amendment would simply reinstate the normal cost estimates and scoring rules that CBO used. In the case of this bill, it would have been all discretionary funding, but now we must identify an offset in order to move forward. This being Suicide Prevention Month, and with suicide prevention being our highest priority in this committee, I can't think of a more important reason to remove the obstacles and advance this bill. So let me say this again. My amendment would not eliminate or cut the toxic exposure funds in any way. CBO has confirmed that and will not touch the $500 million that has already been appropriated into the fund, and it would not limit what can be appropriated in the fund in the future. My amendment would simply resolve the mandatory scoring problem that will paralyze this committee if not addressed. I urge all members to support my amendment. Otherwise, we will constantly be struggling to advance other important and even life-saving legislation in this Congress and future Congresses. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate the Ranking Member Boss' intent in offering this amendment. It raises an important issue, which is the long-term implications of the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund, or TEF, as it has become known as, created by the Honoring Our Pact Act. Now, this fund is absolutely crucial. And when I say this fund, I'm talking about the TEF fund, that's redundant, the Toxic Exposure Fund, is absolutely crucial to ensuring VA has the resources necessary to fully support our veterans and to deliver the new benefits available to them without having to sacrifice existing programs. And so any potential change to this fund and how it operates must be considered very carefully and requires the input of other committees that have a stake in this issue, to include appropriations and budget. Appropriations Committee and the Budget Committee. Accordingly, I must oppose the Ranking Member's amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. The Toxic Exposure Fund has created some complications for the committee in terms of how legislation is being scored. Historically, certain benefits programs have always been considered mandatory spending, and we address that as it comes up, such as in Representative Fletcher's bill. However, much of our legislation, especially related to healthcare issues, has not been subject to mandatory spending. At present, CBO has taken a very rigid and unnuanced approach to scoring legislation in the wake of the PACT Act's passage, and estimating that many bills will have 30% mandatory spending costs, whether or not the subject of the legislation is toxic exposure. However, I believe that as implementation begins and more cost estimates and data are available, CBO will be able to adjust its assumptions and more finely tune its methodology. Continued conversations with VA, CBO, and the Appropriations and Budget Committees will likely lessen the impact of the fund on authorizations not related to toxic exposure. Now, I remind you that the intent of the PACT Act and the intent of Congress in the PACT Act was to stop pitting veterans against seniors, children, and other Americans. It means not pitting toxic exposed veterans against other veterans, but these amendments today would effectively do that. Congress has already spoken on this issue when it passed the PACT Act, legislation many of you voted to support, and this committee should not use this as a venue to undo what Congress just did. We passed the PACT Act because toxic exposure is a cost of war, and our country needs to pay for the health care and benefits those veterans earned. What we did with the PACT Act is say that veterans are sacred ground, and I believe we did the right thing. Our country needs to pay for the health care and benefits those veterans have earned. Nonetheless, this scoring issue is not a bar and should not be a bar to considering this legislation today. Discussion of mandatory scoring can continue before any legislation is considered for the floor, and we have more opportunity to engage legislative stakeholders and consider some solutions with CBO. As I've said previously, any discussion of modification needs to happen in a fuller and more detailed conversation than we can have today solely in this committee. I urge us to proceed with consideration of the bills on the merits of the proposed policy and continue the discussion of the Cost of War Fund until after this markup. I think continuing to advance legislation out of committee is the most prudent thing to do so that it leaves us well positioned to pass bills on the House floor once we do get this issue resolved. So while I, again, appreciate the ranking member's intent with this amendment, I must oppose and encourage members to vote against it as well. However, I want to say to you, Ranking Member Boss, that I and my staff will continue to engage with you and your staff on this scoring issue. I conclude my remarks. Is there any further debate on the Boss Amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Roy.
Well, I thank the chairman. I would like to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and note that this was a entirely foreseeable consequence of going down the road of mandatory spending. And we knew this. This is why there were 174 no votes on such an important piece of legislation. There is no universe in which the 174 members of the United States House of Representatives who voted against the PACT Act don't want to see care and support for the veterans who are dealing with the consequences of exposure to burn pits in service of their country. Nevertheless, a sizable chunk of this body voted no, almost entirely. There were a few other reasons why. There's a large amount of money that was unpaid for, but almost entirely because of this provision of pushing this into the mandatory spending bucket. And that it's because we're going to have the kinds of consequences we're now dealing with here today. I think the chairman, I think the ranking member is correct to be raising this issue. It would be right to raise it on every single one of the bills that are impacted as a direct consequence of what we did in committee and then what the House did by pushing it through this way. I heard the chairman say that it's trying to end pitting veterans against other individuals or certain veterans against veterans. I mean, but this is part of the problem, right? We have to make choices. We have to make decisions. And when you pull things out of the discretionary context and you put them into the mandatory context, whether it's TANF, whether it's Medicare, whether it's Social Security, whether it's provisions of care for veterans, you now put us in the situation that has resulted in significant part of having $30.5 trillion of debt, number one. And number two, it means that you're not having to make the tough decisions that every business, family, nonprofit, and organization around this country has to make every day, having to make choices. I could raise this issue with respect to Ukraine, any other number of issues that are meritorious. But if you don't have to choose, for example, between guns and butter, if you don't have to make a choice, for example, about how to fund health care for veterans and how to prioritize the resources you have, then you end up with a situation, for example, under the PACT Act, which obviously has now been signed into law, where you have the criteria that were put in place, which still raise serious questions about to how many people are going to be able to get care, whether we'll end up boxing some people out from care because you're going to have more people getting care under that criteria than perhaps were directly connected to the burn pit exposure. And we can have that debate, and we can go around, and we had that debate before. But now here we sit, and as a result of this, we now have massive complications with the way we deal with the scoring, which really is just budgets and DC speak for how we're paying for this stuff. And I think we've got to have a reckoning in this body about how we fund things and stop funding things with money that we do not have. And we can have a righteous debate about tax policy and spending policy. Happy to have it. Happy to entertain those notions on the floor, in this committee, in appropriations, wherever it is. But we've got to have a serious conversation about those things because it's all too easy to, in the name of compassion and what we want to do to help people, to write blank checks. I voted against an ALS research authorization bill. I mean, you think I don't want to come up with research to help people with ALS or a dreaded disease that people die within a year and you can't get pharmaceutical companies to do tests on it because, frankly, people are gone too quickly? Of course we need to do research for ALS. But it's $500 million authorized again that's unpaid for. And we continue to do that. We continue to kick the can down the road. And veterans who served this country, didn't serve this country, and get exposed to burn pits to end up with a bankrupt country or a VA that can't actually care for its veterans in the end because the dollar isn't worth anything and because we've spent ourselves into oblivion. So I think we ought to have this debate. I think we ought to do it on each of these measures. I assume for the sake of time that we'll just have the discussion on this one, but we'll see. I'll defer to the ranking member. But I do think this is an important issue, and I think it's something that we're going to be reckoning with for a while because we jammed that through without dealing with the realities of what you do when you make things mandatory spending. I yield back.
Any other discussion on the bill before us? Anyone else? I don't see anyone else wishing to speak. So if there's no further debate on the amendment, I will call for a vote. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Boston Amendment is not agreed to. A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient second? I do hear a sufficient second. A recorded vote is ordered pursuant to Committee Rule 4. Further proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. We'll now consider H.R. 3793. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3793 to authorize the Secretary of Veterans
Text was
Affairs.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Roy for 5 minutes in support of his bill.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Distracted for a second. Well, I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to have introduced this bill. It's a bipartisan bill. Introduced it with Representatives Miller Meeks, Slotkin, and Levin. The purpose of the bill is to support veterans and military families across the country. As most or all members of this committee know, the service members, SGLI, the group life insurance policy, and the VGLI, the Veterans Group Life Insurance, gives thousands of veterans and military families peace of mind by ensuring that if anything happens to them, their families will be supported. Unfortunately, the coverage amounts have not been updated for about 17 years, since 2005. And so the outdated policy amounts leave military families worried about what will happen in the event of the unthinkable. The issue was first brought to my attention by one of my constituents, an active duty service member who was reviewing his policy and saw the $400,000 amount and felt that it'd be better if it could be a little higher. And he actually sent an email to my staff and to me saying that SGLA represents a commitment from America that in the event you die protecting this nation, America has you and your families back. It provides peace of mind that allows the service members to do their duty, knowing that if the worst happens, at least their family will all be okay financially and they can mourn and not suffer another catastrophe. This is his writing. My own best friend was an Air Force F-16 pilot when he died in an air crash in 2014. His wife and 2 young daughters received the SGLI. His daughters were babies when the accident occurred, and now they're teenagers. And I've watched them over the years mourn their father, yet have a normal life of sports and dances and events thanks to that money, and it matters. It's the one benefit you never want to use, but it might be the most important. This legislation is a straightforward solution. It increases the SGLI and VGLI maximum coverage amount option from $400,000 to $500,000. That'll obviously help deal with the significant inflation we're facing at the moment. Service members and veterans can then customize the coverage amount that best fits their family's needs. I think it's common sense, bipartisan solution. It mostly, pays for itself and is not a significant financial impact. I think with the exception of active duty service members that might have some additional cost if they're serving in combat, which of all areas in which we can spend money, that's obviously one that we all generally agree on. So with that, I will yield back to the chairman and appreciate the time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Roy. The life insurance is designed to offer protection from loss and serves as a death benefit. For a veteran or a service member, VA group life insurance offers security and confidence that loved ones will be covered and made financially whole in the event a source of income is lost. And while no amount of money can replace the life of a beloved family member, VA service members and veterans group life insurance exists to provide an affordable option to provide a fiscal shield for survivors. The loss of life does not have to equate to the loss of financial security when there are adequate VA life insurance choices available to ensure a family is protected in the unfortunate death of a service member or veteran. I do encourage my colleagues to support this bill. Is there any further discussion on H.R. 3793?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Chairman. I support Congressman Roy's bill, H.R. 3793, the Supporting Families of the Fallen Act. The Service Members Group Life Insurance, or SGLI, and Veterans Group Life Insurance, VGLI, programs provide coverage to certain survivors of service members and veterans, respectively. H.R. 3793 would make much-needed updates to the coverage amounts for these insurance programs. The legislation would allow VA to raise the maximum payment from $400,000 to $500,000. The coverage for SGLI and VGLI have not changed in 17 years. $400,000 may have been a sufficient in the economy of 2005, but this increase is needed right now when Americans are facing the highest inflation in decades. It would, in the wake of the loss of a family member, this increase of $100,000 could help the surviving spouse to keep a roof over their family's head and food on the table. This bill would give our veterans and their families peace of mind with this added financial security, and I urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further discussion? Are we missing? Are we short one? Are we missing? We need people back on. Members, but we have people like away from there. Do we have a quorum? Okay, thank you. If there are no further members wishing to seek recognition, I'll now call on Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 3793 favorably to the full House of Representatives. I think I'm on the right section there. I am.
Okay. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental, additional, and dissenting views on H.R. 3793.
Without objection. And without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conformance changes in the committee amendments. We will now consider H.R. 8888. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R.
Text was
8888.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Today, we are considering Congresswoman Peltola's bill, the Food Security for All Veterans Act, which would establish an office dedicated to ending veteran hunger at VA. This newly established VA Office of Food Security will collaborate with internal and external groups to develop and implement policies and procedures to identify and treat veterans at risk or experiencing hunger. That should say at risk of or experiencing hunger. The bill requires VA to work with the Departments of Agriculture and Defense to develop materials for the Transition Assistance Program to help increase access to food resources for families in need as they navigate the military to civilian transition. Before the pandemic and still now, Black, Latino, Native American, and Native Alaskan veteran families experience disproportionately higher rates of hunger. This bill requires VA to coordinate efforts with a focus on these subpopulations. And one of the issues this bill intends to affect is the disparities in VA and USDA data. USDA reports that about 11% rate of food insecurity among veterans versus VA, which reports a roughly 2% rate among veterans using VA health care. Congresswoman Peltola's bill requires VA, in consultation with USDA, to issue an annual report to Congress on the prevalence of veteran hunger and progress in connecting more veterans with resources like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as SNAP. September is Hunger Action Month. The Biden administration and this Congress have made ending hunger a priority. Next week, the White House will host a conference that will catalyze the public and private sectors around a coordinated strategy to accelerate progress and drive transformative change in the United States to end hunger. The Food Security for All Veterans Act is a critical part of this committee's role in executing solutions to end veteran hunger. I urge my colleagues to vote yes for Congresswoman Patola's bill. Is there further debate on H.R. 8888?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I must reluctantly oppose this bill. While I support finding ways to reduce food insecurity for veterans, creating more bureaucracy is not the best way to do this. VA is already taking steps to improve the food insecurity program. The department also opposed the creation of the office as described in this bill, as they are already working on creating such an office at the Veterans Health Administration. They also have testified that this bill, while well-intentioned, would interfere with their efforts to curb food insecurity. I look forward to working with members of this committee to find a better way and better approaches to addressing the issue. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Are there any further members seeking recognition to speak on this bill? Hearing or seeing none, I move that H.R. 8888 be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. Independent Chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. And without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Mr. Ranking Member.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 888.
Without objection. We will now move to consider H.R. 8852. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 8852,
Text was
direct.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Now, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Today, we are considering Congresswoman Jacobs' bill, the End Veteran Hunger Act, which she introduced with Chairman Levin, Chairwoman Brownlee, and Congresswoman Spear. In July, I traveled to San Diego to participate in the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee's field hearing entitled Ending Veteran Hunger, Examining the Impact of COVID-19 on Food Insecurity. I left that hearing concerned about how VA is addressing veteran hunger, and I encouraged the agency to do more. Since then, our committee has worked closely with VA, USDA, the Agriculture Committee, and nonprofit partners on the issue. And I'm proud of the focused collaboration to end veteran food insecurity. Congresswoman Jacobs' bill requires VA to carry out a 5-year pilot grant program aimed at connecting veterans and transitioning service members with the nutrition and resources they need. Stable access to nutritious food is a foundational element of a person's health. Food insecurity can create and exacerbate other issues and is one of the many contributing factors that has led to increased suicide rates, diabetes, heart disease, and depression. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, addressing veteran hunger is critical to our suicide prevention efforts. Every day, too many veterans live with food insecurity. Between 2015 and 2019, approximately 1 in 10 working-age veterans experienced food insecurity. The End Veteran Hunger Act of 2022 would address the gap in veterans' access to federal food and nutrition resources by empowering the agencies and organizations best equipped to reach them. Eligible grantees include community-based organizations and VSOs, and 5 of the grants must go to tribal organizations to help alleviate hunger among our Native American veteran families. Grantees will provide direct access to food resources for veterans in urgent need of nutrition assistance. Grantees will be required to support long-term solutions to sustain food security by increasing access to and enrollment in SNAP and other federal nutrition programs, and providing nutrition, counseling, and education. This bill, coupled with Congresswoman Patola's bill, doubles down on our core belief that no veteran should experience food insecurity. But if they do, that we will help make sure that organizations are equipped to help. Given the shared commitment of the Biden-Harris administration, Congress, the VA, and nonprofit advocates have in ending hunger. The time is ripe to make sure food insecurity is a lasting priority by making an office dedicated to the issue permanent so that it can exist in perpetuity in future administrations. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 8852 and help put an end to veteran hunger. Is there further discussion on H.R. 8852? Ranking member?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Text was circulated in
8852.
advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes. in
Thank you,
support of the
Mr.
amendment.
Chairman. As I explained earlier, my amendment would remove the budget gimmick that Senate added to the Toxic Exposure Fund and the PACT Act. Mr. Chairman, I would revert the fund's language back to the original version that you wrote and the House passed. It would not cut toxic exposed funds in any way, but it would remove the budgetary handcuffs that will prevent the committee from advancing all sorts of legislation now and in the future. I have a firm belief that we must solve the problem sooner rather than later. However, in the interest of time, I'm willing to withdraw my amendment at this time.
I thank the ranking member for his consideration.
Thank-
I accept your offer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I will still have to oppose the bill because I do not believe that the bill is needed. There's no doubt that there is a need to address food insecurity, but I do not believe that the postponed grant fund is advisable in its current form. The VA agreed and testified at legislative hearings earlier this year that they believe that this grant program was too restrictive and not needed. VA is currently providing new screening tools to track veterans for food insecurity issues. They testified earlier this year that since 2017, they've completed 17 million of these screenings. I also think the grant program proposed in this bill would be better managed by the USDA and the Food and Nutrition Services and not the VA. I hope to work with the chairman to address this policy and cost concerns before we take up this bill on the floor, and I reluctantly recommend to our members to oppose the bill, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Ms. Brownlee seeks recognition. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief, but thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important bill. As already has been said, veterans and their families who are experiencing food insecurity in this country is just wholly unacceptable. Ensuring veterans have the food and nutrition they need is a basic and critical component to their overall health and wellness. We know that veterans often experience challenges navigating the confusing system of nutritional support services they may be eligible for. The End Veteran Hunger Act takes a collective approach to ending veterans' food insecurity. It authorizes VA to provide community-based organizations funding to help connect veterans with existing nutritional support programs. This is a great bill. I was happy to co-author it with Congresswoman Jacobs, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this critical piece of legislation. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. Is there any further debate on the Jacobs bill? If there's not, I move that H.R. 8852 be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary and technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking member?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, and dissenting views on H.R. 8852.
Without objection. We will now consider H.R. 8875. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 8875 to amend
Text
Title
is circulated in
38.
advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. We'll now consider the Expanding Home Loans for Guard and Reservists Act from Representative Ryan. Nearly 2 years ago, we expanded the home loan program to allow more Guard and Reservists to qualify. However, we missed out covering all those who have earned the benefit. This legislation makes a technical fix which updates the law to define eligibility by counting active duty for training when Guard and Reservists are training for things like Special Forces, aviation, or linguistics. I'm pleased to see Representative Ryan hit the ground running with this common sense technical fix legislation to make sure that Guard and Reservists don't miss out using a great benefit from the VA Home Loan Guarantee Service. I understand the minority has concerns with process, but this is a technical fix that has been scored by CEO and saves the government money. These service members deserve eligibility because they are going through the same courses and training as their active duty counterparts, taking the very same risks, and passing the same requirements. These Guard and Reservist service members are at a greater disadvantage because they are removed from the civilian workforce for extended periods of time, and after their training is complete, they need to transition back to civilian life, move back home from the base they were training at, and find employment and find a place to live. The VA home loan benefit is the kind of benefit these individuals need to transition back to civilian life effectively, and I thank Representative Ryan for bringing this fix to the committee. Is there further debate on H.R. 8875? Ranking Member, do you wish to comment on H. 8875?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, I have to oppose this bill. I certainly believe the expanding home loan benefits to members of the National Guard, but last Congress, it was my bill, matter of fact, H.R. 7445, that first proposed expanding the benefits of the members of the National Guard who have served on full-time active duty. I was proud that this expansion was later enacted in the Eikenson-Rowe omnibus package. Mr. Ryan's bill would expand the benefits of members of National Guard that are on federal active duty orders for training. I tend to agree with those who believe that active duty for training is very different from federal active duty to support ongoing operations. I could also be persuaded that this is reasonable expansion. However, members of the committee have not been given the opportunity to hear testimony and views on this bill for stakeholders or from the administration. This is because, unlike every other bill we have on the agenda today, this bill has not been subject to a legislative hearing. A hearing will allow us to understand the true impact this legislation can have on the ever-changing mortgage market and on recruitment and retention of both the National Guard and active forces. It is my hope that next Congress we can have a hearing on the benefits that are and are not provided to the members of the National Guard. We should be reviewing these benefits in a comprehensive way that assures that DOD is doing their part to put members on the right type of orders. Unfortunately, DOD has had a bad track record in this regard. But like I said, we have not had the opportunity to ask these types of questions in the hearing. That is unfortunate and does not best serve the veterans. So I urge our members to oppose, or all members to oppose the bill. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Any further discussion on H.R. 8875? All right, members who are joining us virtually, please show your faces so we can count you toward the quorum. Are we missing a quorum? Count 12. Ms. Frankel, we need Ms. Luria and Ms. Capter to show. Hi, Ms. Luria. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Luria. Okay, there we are. Do we have it?
We got one more. If back on camera.
I count 15. 15.
Okay, so a quorum has been reestablished. Okay, any further debate on H.R. 8875? All right, If not, I move that HR 8875, I move that HR 8875 be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed, will say no. No. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking member?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 8875.
Without objection, I now call up H.R. 2800. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2800 to
Without
amend
objection,
title.
first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make an inquiry.
Sir? Can you state your inquiry?
I mean, I know we're struggling to get a quorum established here, but according to my count, we have majority. So not to be technical, but how is it that you can make a decision that the so-called majority actually had the majority in that vote in support when, in reality, you don't have the majority in this room or participating in this hearing?
The member can call for a roll call vote if you would like. The member does not wish to call for, so we will now proceed. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Oh, let me call it. I now call up H.R. 2800. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2800 to amend Title 38 United States Code to permit
Without
veterans to
objection,
grant.
the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Ranking Member Boss in support of the bill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Congressman Perry's bill, H.R. 2800, the Wingman Act. One of the most important services we provide to our constituents is the act as liaison between our veterans and the VA. Unfortunately, the VA lacks of timely communication, often prevents Congress caseworkers from providing a quick response to veterans' inquiries. Our workers must and often wait weeks or months to get responses from VA because they do not have the access to the VA system. By the time we get the information, the VA claim may have already been decided. The veteran may have to appeal and wait even longer to receive their earned benefits. The Wingman Act would solve this problem. This bill would allow designated permanent full-time congressional staffers to look up the status of claims in the VA database, similar to the way veteran service officers currently do. Staffers would only be able to do this with the veteran's permission, and they would only be able to read the information and never edit the information. This bill would help members cut through the red tape to help constituents who have applied for VA benefits. I understand that some of my colleagues are concerned that this bill may expose veterans to private information. My caseworkers are some of the most upstanding, honorable individuals that I've worked with. One of them happens to be a veteran himself who is dedicated to helping his fellow veterans. Quite frankly, it's insulting to imply that our caseworkers who already handle sensitive information are not trusted to access VA system. The bill includes guardrails to protect veterans' private information. Further, we should monitor our staff's access and make sure VA does the same. This bill would allow us to serve our veterans' constituents more extensively, which is what many of us on the committee came here to do. I'm disappointed that the majority did not offer any changes addressing the concerns, but I hope that they reconsider their opposition and advance the bill, and I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. Does any other member wish to address H.R. 2800? I will offer my remarks. I recognize myself. So thank you, Ranking Member Boss. While I support providing congressional offices more tools and transparency in supporting their constituents with processing benefits and claims, VSOs and the VA have both highlighted several questions and concerns regarding the legislation. I'm concerned about the complexity of such a project and about cybersecurity. So those questions and concerns have been made known to the minority. Before undertaking something like this, VA and both the House and Senate need to come together to determine the best way to accomplish these goals and ensure that veterans' information is not compromised. Now, I think this is a good opportunity to engage with the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress to improve members' ability to provide services for their constituents. In their final report from last Congress, ModCom, as it's known, specifically recommended that House Information Resources prioritize the development of secure templates and document storage, as well as the ability to upload casework and other requests digitally. While I would oppose this legislation in its current form, I do look forward to continuing a discussion between our staff and between you and me on this topic. Is there any further debate on H.R. 2800? Mr. Roy.
I think the chairman, I'd like to issue myself to remarks to the ranking member and just note that it sure, I think, dealing with my constituent services team, who I think do an exceptional job, as I'm sure many of my colleagues agree and share. This is a hurdle that they do deal with on a regular basis. I'm not insensitive to the points the chairman is making about ensuring we do it the right way, but I think that our colleague, Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania, has raised an important issue. I would support it on the merits as it is to move forward and vote for it, because I think our staff, when we hire staff into our offices, members of Congress, look, I mean, they're dealing with, confidential and, private information often and regularly with dealing with our constituents. And we just, we have to hire good staff and work with them to make sure that they can do it the right way. But I think the purpose of the bill is a good one, which I think the chairman probably agrees with, at least the intent of, or in general terms, the intent of what's trying to be accomplished. But I would support it as it is. I trust my caseworkers to do this work and to handle the sensitive information. They're hired to represent and help those constituents. That's on us to make sure we hire the right people to do that. I think we all do that and do it well. In the same way, the VA has to hire people that you're going to trust to be able to manage and look at this information. So do we. And I think it would massively facilitate our ability to serve veterans. So I support the legislation in its current form.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Any other member wish to comment on H.R. 2800? All right.
I count 15. 601.
15, we good? Quorum is present.
We require 16? We need one more. The clerk just said that we need one more. Oh, people, please.
We're almost there.
I mean, it's both sides. It's not.
Huh?
Counsel says 15 for quorum. Which is it? Which is it? 16 or 15? We've got counsel saying 15 up here. We got 16
I believe
down.
15 is quorum. Do we have 15?
We do have 15.
We have 15. Are we agreed? All right, so a quorum is present. If there's no further debate on H.R. 28, I will call on Ranking Member Bost. 2800, H.R. 2800, I call on Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Chairman, I ask that the committee report H.R. 2800 favorably to the House of Representatives. I did not have my microphone on. I can redo that again if need be.
Why don't you go ahead, sir?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report H.R. 2800 favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. Ranking Member, you want to?
It's not on the script, but I know where I got to go back to. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of the intent to file mandatory, minority, and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 2800.
Without objection. Okay. Without objection, we'll take Mr. Banks's bill out of order. Okay. We'll now consider H.R. 5918. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5918 to amend Title
Text was
38.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. And I recognize Mr. Banks for 5 minutes to discuss his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My legislation is simple, and it would help service members who are disadvantaged by an unintended loophole. The bill would equalize the treatment of service members and veterans who paid into the Montgomery GI Bill, but later used the post 9/11 GI Bill. Some of these service members are unable to receive a refund for the $1,200 they initially paid into the Montgomery GI Bill because the VA pays out such refunds as part of their housing allowance. If they don't receive a housing allowance from the VA, they also haven't been receiving the $1,200 they are entitled to. This is a complicated situation that no one ever intended to happen. My bill would make sure that it doesn't happen anymore. It would direct the VA to make the repayment before the service member exhausts their education assistance. I do support Ranking Member Bost's amendment in the nature of a substitute to offset the cost of my legislation, and I thank him as well for offering it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. I recognize Ranking Member Bost to offer his amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, I have an A&S at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a
Text was
substitute.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Mr. Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support
Thank you,
of
Mr.
your
Chairman. I'd like to thank Congressman Banks for introducing this important bill that would close a loophole affecting many service members. Last Congress, I was proud to support General Berkman's effort to responsibly sunset the Montgomery GI Bill. The benefit has helped millions of veterans over the years, but it is time to set the stage for the continued success of the post-9/11 GI Bill. In this same vein, I am pleased to support Mr. Banks's bill to ensure that those service members who paid into the program are treated equally and receive their $1,200 back when they complete their studies. My INS would keep the base text of the bill, but would amend the effective date to include a short-term extension of the VA home loan funding fees. This extension fully offsets the cost of this bill, and I thank the American Legion for bringing this problem to our attention, and I urge all members to support my amendment in the nature of a substitute, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Under current law, veterans can lose up to $1,200 should they sign up for the Montgomery GI Bill and not fully use the benefit. The process to reclaim that $1,200 can be difficult, or at times, the veteran can simply lose out on the money because they waited too long. This legislation ensures that the veteran is repaid. The bill is supported by the Veteran Service Organization community, including by Student Veterans of America. I support the underlying bill and the Bost Amendment in the nature of a substitute. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the ANS to H.R. 5918? Seeing none, the question is now on the Bost amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5918. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. What did I skip?
Yeah, we need to move the.
Oh, no, we omitted the part.
Recognized for amendment.
We have to vote on the.
Yeah. Rick, I'll make the motion.
Yeah, so I withdraw my comments about the here. Okay. I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee report, H.R. 5918, as amended, favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make the necessary technical and conforming changes to the committee amendments, in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Boss.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice to intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 5918 as amended.
Without objection. Okay. Yeah, we're going. We'll now move on to consider H.R. 1957. The clerk will designate the bill offered by Ms. Brownlee.
H.R. 1957 to amend Title 38 United
Without
States
objection,
Code.
first reading is dispensed with, and I recognize Ms. Brownlee to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR 1957 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Ms. Brownlee, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that this legislation has been brought forward today. As we previously discussed in an earlier legislative hearing, my bill will make treatment for infertility, including IVF, a part of healthcare at VA. Currently, infertility care at VA is limited to straight married veterans who can prove their infertility is connected to their service. This is difficult to prove for conditions like low sperm counts and endometriosis. Moreover, 1/3 of infertility cases have unknown causes. Since 2016, only 800 veterans have been referred for IVF care through the VA. For those deemed ineligible, they have to take their chances outside the VA and pay out of pocket to treat a disease that impacts the totality of their lives. Let me be clear. Infertility is a disease. It affects the physical and mental well-being of thousands of veterans and their partners. Veterans should have access to the care they need to treat their condition the same way they receive care for any other medical condition, from appendicitis to cancer. Infertility care is health care. Over a 3-year period from fiscal year 2018 to 2020, nearly 13,000 veterans received a diagnosis of infertility from VA. They deserve treatment, no matter the cause. The Veterans Infertility Treatment Act would remove the service connection requirement and allow VA to treat infertility like any other medical condition. Additionally, it would expand access to LGBTQ veterans and single veterans. It would also ensure our most catastrophically disabled veterans would have the opportunity to pursue a family by allowing the use of donated embryos. Most of all, this bill affirms that any veteran who struggles with infertility or is at risk of infertility due to a medical condition or treatment is able to be made as whole as possible by the institution that exists to serve them. Infertility has enormous impacts on our veterans. They deserve the full spectrum of care this government can provide. After everything our veterans have done for us, it is the least we can do for them. Today, I am offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute that makes minor technical changes, including adding a travel benefit for the partner of the person receiving infertility treatment, should the couple need to travel for care. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to the VSOs and advocacy groups. Your years of advocacy on this issue helped bring this bill to fruition. Your work is an inspiration. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this very important bill. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ms. Brownlee. If a veteran has a medical condition, this country is bound by a sacred promise to do everything we can to treat it, from cancer to PTSD to broken bones. The VA Health Administration provides treatment for veterans' medical needs. VHA treats all medical conditions except infertility. Infertility is a disease and should be treated as such. Veterans give their health, bodily well-being, and the bulk of their reproductive years to serving this country. We know that both men and women veterans experience infertility at higher rates than their civilian counterparts. VA should be empowered to treat these veterans. For years, Chairwoman Brownlee has worked tirelessly to expand access to infertility treatment for veterans. This bill would ensure infertility treatment is a part of health care at VA, removing the onerous burden of proving a service connection to get treatment. It also removes the prohibition on treating same-sex couples, single veterans, or catastrophically injured veterans by allowing for use of donated gametes. This bill will change the lives of thousands of veterans who otherwise would not be able to afford the out-of-pocket costs of infertility treatment. I fully support the Brownlee amendment. Is there further debate on the Brownlee ANS?
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
I have a substitute to the amendment in the nature of the substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the substitute to the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Substitute for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Text was
HR.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My substitute amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1957 would codify the existing VA IVF benefit and ensure VA is able to offer IVF to seriously disabled, service-connected veterans on a permanent basis. VA current IVF authority is in line with DOD, creating parity between the two departments. I am incredibly sympathetic to the veterans and families who are unable to expand their families without the use of assistance reproduction technology like IVF. However, at this time, I have serious reservations about expanding the availability of IVF to every veteran struggling with infertility. The underlying bill is a significant expansion of very complicated, expensive, and controversial procedures. It would allow embryos, human lives, to be destroyed and discarded. In contrast, my amendment would codify the current prohibition against the destruction or discarding of embryos by VA. It would also encourage embryo adoption so that the embryos created through IVF that a veteran and his or her spouse elect not to use could be offered to another family struggling with infertility. Finally, my amendment would revert the Toxic Exposure Fund in the PACT Act back to the original language, House language, as I discussed earlier. Representative Brownlee's bill carries tens of millions of dollars of mandatory costs because of the unintended impact of the Toxic Exposure Fund. CBO made it clear why this is happening. My amendment would simply reinstate the normal cost estimates and scoring rules of CBO has been using for all health programs up until now. And let me say it again, my amendment will not eliminate or cut the Toxic Exposure funding in any way. And I urge my colleagues to support my substitute amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1957. And with that, I yield back the remaining balance of my time.
I recognize Chairwoman Brownlee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of concerns with the ranking member's amendment. Today, veterans who cannot prove their infertility is caused by their service cannot access infertility care, period. Veterans who are not straight cannot access infertility care. Veterans who are not married cannot access infertility care. The amendment seeks to maintain the status quo, letting our veterans go without treatment for their medical condition. These restrictions are needless, sometimes offensive, and prevent many of our veterans from accessing the care they need to feel whole and live the full post-service lives they aspire to. Additionally, this amendment directs VA to create a plan that encourages embryo adoption among veterans. Currently, VA regulations around IVF and embryo adoption are based on a Department of Defense implementing guidance memorandum dated April 3rd, 2012. This memorandum, upon which VA's regulations are based, states third-party donations or surrogacy are not covered benefits. The benefit is designed to allow the member and spouse to become biological parents through reproductive technologies where the active duty injury or illness has made it impossible to conceive naturally. The VHA directive citing this DOD memo goes on to say, therefore, under this treatment authority, VA bars the use of donated sperm or embryos or gestational surrogacy. It's my understanding that the ranking member's amendment removes the provision of my bill that decouples VA's IVF policy from DOD's policy. Yet it directs the VA to develop a plan to encourage veterans to adopt embryos, something VA does not have the regulatory authority to do if VA continues to base its IVF policy on DOD's policy. In other words, this amendment will strip my bill of the authority the amendment itself needs to direct VA to create a plan to encourage embryo adoption among veterans. To me, this indicates the minority's misunderstanding of the issue. My bill gives VA the authority to give veterans the treatment they need for their infertility. My bill would give VA the authority it needs to allow for the use of donated embryos, eggs, or sperm. My bill also removes subjective requirements that cause our veterans undue burden and stress. The amendment before us would cause confusion and confliction within VA's infertility treatment policy. We should be simplifying and expanding access to care for veterans, not complicating and restricting it. For this reason, I encourage my colleagues on this committee to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Brownlee. Is there any further, are other members wishing to speak on the ENS or the substitute ENS? Mr. Roy?
And I would offer my general support for what I believe the ranking member is trying to do. There are obviously a number of complex issues here involving our views about life and individuals that make decisions about how they engage in IVF. I've had numerous friends of mine who believe life begins at conception, who go through the painstaking process of only implanting 1 and 2 at a time. And there's a lot of debates, obviously, about this and not wanting to go too far down that road per se. But in broad terms, I have serious reservations about the underlying bill with respect to expansion of IVF more broadly, which is my understanding. This would expand it more broadly than and direct service-connected injury, and in doing so, I mean, we've got large numbers of private insurance companies that do not cover IVF, and this gets back to my original point earlier when we were talking about the mandatory spending related to PAC, about the costs associated with these kinds of decisions when we're talking about this kind of expansion. And then the expansion to same-sex couples just sort of begs the logical question about IVF with respect to from a biological matter, and it just begs the question about what are we funding, and making a choice here in terms of expanding IVF to same-sex couples. So from my standpoint here, I think the ranking member is making a good faith effort to try to improve this legislation, which I think has serious flaws in the underlying bill. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Does any other member wish to speak to the substitute ANS? I will then recognize myself for 5 minutes. I'll just respond first to the gentleman from Texas's questioning about whether this should be, whether IVF should be made available to same-sex couples. In fact, there are many, many same-sex couples across the nation that are using IVF to have children. This is about anybody's right in our country to exercise reproductive freedom. And reproductive freedom in this case means the ability to start a family and to have children. I hear my colleagues' concern about the cost of Chairwoman Brownlee's bill, but I want to remind my colleagues that from 2018 to 2020, 13,000 veterans received a diagnosis of infertility. Of that 13,000, estimated 90% could be treated with services other than IVF, services that VA already provides. So we're talking about 10% of those that are diagnosed with infertility actually needing IVF. And those that are diagnosed with infertility is a relatively small number. So really, about 1,300 veterans would really likely need IVF, and not all of whom would be willing to pursue going through IVF. So there's no risk of flooding VA with thousands of veterans wishing to be parents, as if that would be a bad thing. If it were true, this level of treatment, IVF treatment, is at the top of the pyramid of fertility care. I mean, there's many other fertility treatments that would probably come first. It is usually the last stop, and after all other services have been exhausted. And if veterans need that last stop to achieve having a family, we should let them try. They deserve to have that try. They have worn the uniform of our country. And I would also point out that the argument about service connection and insisting on service connection in order to, as a precondition for making IVF and fertility treatments available to veterans, I just want to remind my colleagues that that service connection, establishing that service connection is very difficult and murky. But we do know that veterans, both male and female, are diagnosed at a disproportionately higher number than the regular population. And as with the type of attitude we've taken in the PACT Act, I believe we should give our veterans the benefit of the doubt. If there is statistically a significant disparity, which a statistical determination which shows that our veterans, whether they're male or female, are suffering a higher rate of infertility, I think we can conclude that we can reasonably conclude that it has something to do with their service, even though we may not be able to absolutely confirm it. In any event, making fertility treatments a part of healthcare, saying that it is a part of what should be part of the benefit package we offer to our veterans at VA, that is the absolutely right thing to do. Veterans give some of their best years of their lives as service members, the most fertile years as veterans, and if their ability to have children is negatively impacted because of this service, then we have an obligation to try and make them whole in recognition of that service. So I wholeheartedly support Ms. Brownlee's bill, and I would strongly reject and oppose the ranking member's substitute ANS. Does any other member wish to address the substitute ANS? If not, the question is on the Bost amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Bost amendment is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Ranking member? Okay. The question now, we now proceed to the question of the Brownlee ANS.
I will request a roll call on the last, if I'm not too late on that.
Ranking member Bost, I'm going to, it was too late, but I'm going to, out of courtesy, grant you the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? Yes, second. A recorded vote is requested. Is there a sufficient, so a recorded vote is ordered pursuant to Rule 4, Committee Rule 4, further proceedings on the measure are postponed. We now will go to the, no, I have to go on to the, oh, we have to wait till. We'll now go, we'll now move to consideration back into order, HR 8510. We will now consider HR 8510. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 8510.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and I recognize Mr. Pappas to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8510 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8510, offered by Mr. Pappas. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the
Text
following.
was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Mr. Pappas, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you very much, Chairman Takano. Thank you for accommodating us and getting this on today's markup. Whistleblowers play an essential role in safeguarding the federal government against waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. Department of Veterans Affairs employees often witness problems that put the health, safety, and well-being of veterans at risk. In the best circumstances, when serious problems are pointed out by VA staff, corrective actions taken. But too often, the messenger is the one who's punished. It was information from whistleblowers in 2014 that revealed to Congress and the public that thousands of veterans suffered because department officials had buried data showing lengthy wait times for health care at VA hospitals. This became a major scandal and led to important and long overdue reforms. Whistleblowers like these must be protected from retaliation. This is not only the law, it's also the right thing to do. In 2019, the subcommittee that I lead heard testimony from 3 employees who suffered retaliation after blowing the whistle, including the loss of their positions at VA. In fact, one of the whistleblowers, VA clinical psychologist Minu Agevli from Baltimore, Maryland, received a termination notice just days after our subcommittee's hearing was announced. Based on the investigative record, there was little question as to whether these individuals were legitimate whistleblowers. The question was whether VA would take action. Ms. Agevli's case was only resolved this year. The same was true for Dr. Catherine Mitchell, a VA physician who was instrumental in exposing the wait time scandal. Frustratingly, Dr. Mitchell initially was able to return to work and then faced further retaliation. Third individual we spoke with, Mr. Jeff Detbarm, an X-ray technician from Iowa City. Mr. Detbarn was able to return to his duties in February of this year, but the case took more than 4 years to conclude. So let's underscore this point. For these 3 individuals, the wait for justice was measured in years. I do believe that things have recently improved. VA must do more to earn the trust of whistleblowers and restore faith among department employees who may wish to come forward and report wrongdoing. We need to see permanent changes to policies and procedures, including through improved laws. 5 years ago, Congress established within VA the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection with the goal of bringing more accountability for department whistleblowers. Oddly, however, OAWP's work investigating whistleblower retaliation is duplicative. There's an independent federal agency that also conducts investigations into whistleblower retaliation called the Office of Special Counsel. In fact, in contrast to OAWP, the Office of Special Counsel has the ability to leverage the enforcement of disciplinary measures. Another shortcoming is VA's ability and willingness to make whistleblowers whole after they suffer retaliation. When VA concludes that a retaliation claim is substantiated, typically the employee and the department's lawyers negotiate a signed agreement to reinstate the employee's position and reimburse the employee for lost wages, legal fees, and other needs. However, these settlement agreements typically take months or even years to conclude. Meanwhile, the whistleblower may face financial hardship and psychological strain. Ranking Member Mann and I have reached consensus on a bipartisan bill that would strengthen the independence and mission of VA's whistleblower office. Most notably, H.R. 8510 would end OAWP's investigative authorities, which are duplicative of the Independent Office of Special Counsel. The bill would also hold VA's feet to the fire regarding settlement agreements and would broaden and clarify protections for VA whistleblowers. Today's ANS makes some small clarifying modifications to the bill we initially introduced. The bill is supported by a number of whistleblower advocacy groups, including the Project on Government Oversight, the Government Accountability Project, and the Whistleblowers of America, as well as VA's labor union, AFGE. I urge all committee members to support this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pappas. The bipartisan strengthening whistleblower protections at the Department of Veterans Affairs Act, H.R. 8510, is an important bill that provides protection and support to VA employees who report waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement within the department. I commend Chairman Pappas, Ranking Member Mann, and their subcommittee colleagues for the oversight work on this issue. Over the last 3 years, the subcommittee has examined how effective VA is when protecting whistleblowers and disciplining those who retaliate against them. When retaliation does occur, VA must make whole the whistleblower who is unfairly punished for speaking truth to power. I participated in the subcommittee's hearings, which revealed the mistreatment of whistleblowers even after confirmed findings of retaliation. Witnesses reported a merry-go-round of frustration. We heard firsthand accounts from several individuals of long waits for justice despite experiencing stark examples of retaliation. Clearly, VA can do more to protect whistleblowers. I support Chairman Pappas and Ranking Member Mann's bipartisan legislation. Their bill would promote independence and strengthen the mission of VA's Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. It would streamline duplicative investigations, provide better accountability, and take other critical steps. My understanding is that the ANS makes minor modifications to clarify the intent of the language. The bill has the support of the Project on Government Oversight, the Government Accountability Project, and Whistleblowers of America, as well as the American Federation of Government Employees, all of whom advocate on behalf of whistleblowers. So I urge my colleagues to support the Pappas amendment in nature of substitute. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the ANS to 8510, H.R. 8510?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the ANS. For years, the VA Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection has struggled to perform at the level that Congress and the whistleblowers demand. Despite the best efforts of some dedicated VA employees, it is time for us to remove the investigative function of the office, strengthening protections for whistleblowers, and redirect its efforts to better serve employees. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, would do just that. I would like to thank Chairman Pappas and Ranking Member Mann for introducing H.R. 8510, which includes both Democrat and Republican provisions, and I applaud their bipartisan oversight of the OAWP, this Congress, and I'm glad to see this bill as a product of their work. And with that, I yield back.
Ranking Member Boss, does any other member wish to be recognized? I see Ranking Member Mann of our Oversight Committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8510, the Strengthening Whistleblower Protections at the Department of Veterans Affairs Act. Over the past 2 years, the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee has put a lot of work into examining the deficiencies of the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. The findings of our work led us to the conclusion that, despite the efforts of a number of dedicated VA staff, OAWP's roles and responsibilities must be modified. The ANS to H.R. 8510 would make a number of changes to OAWP, including refocusing the office on providing resources and training to VA employees on whistleblower rights, and, most importantly, removing OAWP's investigative authority. The bill incorporates Democrat priorities and Republican provisions from my bill, H.R. 6638. I want to thank Chairman Pappas for his bipartisan work on this issue and this legislation. I look forward to supporting the A&S today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mann. Is there any further discussion of H.R. 8510? If not, we will now vote. The question is now on the Pappas amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 8510. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Pappas amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Boss for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 8510 as amended favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Boss.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 8510 as amended.
Without objection. We'll now move to consider H.R. 4601. So I call up H.R. 4601. The clerk will please designate the bill. Is our clerk? Where's our clerk?
H.R. 4601 to amend Title 38 United States Code to authorize the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to award grants to states to improve outreach to veterans and for other purposes.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and I now recognize Representative Levin to offer an amendment. Representative Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the ANS. Hold on.
We have to call it the 11 ANS first.
Before we get to your, get a little ahead of yourself there.
Okay.
So, Representative Levin, I think he had a technical issue. We got to let Representative Levin log back on. Mr. Levin?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute
The
to
text is
H.R.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as its original text. For the purposes of amendment, Mr. Levin, you're recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your including my bipartisan legislation, the Commitment to Veteran Support and Outreach Act, or Cvso Act, in today's markup. This is a bipartisan, bicameral bill that I introduced with Representatives Rosendale, Tim Ryan, and McMorris Rogers, alongside Senators Baldwin, Sullivan, Hester, and Daines, to improve veterans' ability to use their benefits. Specifically, the Cvso Act would authorize VA to award competitive grants to bolster the work of county veteran service officers, also known as CVSOs. CVSOs are local county employees who are nationally accredited by VA to prepare, present, and prosecute VA claims. They're often veterans and their families' best allies in navigating the red tape at VA, and the first to inform them about resources at their disposal. CVSOs help enroll veterans into the Veterans Health Administration and provide assistance on a range of benefits, including service-connected disability compensation, VA home loans, education benefits, and job placement assistance. The grant funding provided under the Cvso Act will be used to hire additional CVSOs, train more CVSOs for VA accreditation, improve outreach to veterans, and otherwise enhance CVSO's ability to support veterans. This is particularly important for the millions of veterans who gain benefits under the recently enacted PACT Act and need help accessing them. While this is not a mental health program, it'll strengthen economic supports, improve access to care, and enhance connectedness, key strategies that reduce risk and promote protective factors for suicide. For those reasons, I urge my colleagues to support the Cvso Act today. That's also why the National Association of State Directors of Veterans Affairs, or NASVDA, the National Association of Counties, or NACO, and the National Association of CVSOs, or NACVSO, among others, support this legislation. I have a statement for the record from those organizations to that effect and ask that they be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. This bill authorizes VA to provide grants to states to implement programs that provide outreach and assistance to veterans and their families to ensure that such individuals are fully informed about veterans' benefits and programs. Specifically, VA may provide grants to states to implement or enhance outreach activities or activities to assist in development and submittal of claims for veterans or increase the number of county or tribal veteran service officers in the state. Additionally, VA would be required to prioritize awarding grants in areas with a critical shortage of county or tribal veteran service officers, areas with high rates of suicide among veterans, and areas with high rates of referrals to the Veterans Crisis Line. With high-profile, sweeping veterans legislation like the PACT Act recently signed into law, the support and outreach offered by H.R. 4601 would greatly assist in implementing such new programs as smoothly as possible. With enhanced communication and outreach focused on explaining new benefits and services to a broader range of veterans and their families, the more opportunities we will have to connect with potential beneficiaries interacting with VA for the very first time. With more accredited claims representatives available to assist with the preparation and submission of claim applications, the better positioned VA will be to decide these claims in a more timely and accurate manner. And with funds to recruit and train more county and tribal veteran service officers, helpful skills and information related to life-changing benefits and other VA services will reach farther into our veteran communities that are so often and undeservedly overlooked. I recently visited the Navajo Nation. When I recently visited the Navajo Nation, I heard that this legislation would be extremely helpful to their efforts to assist veterans with accessing their benefits. So I am pleased tribes will be able to directly apply for these grants. I thank Representative Levin for crafting this important legislation and urge my colleagues to support the amendment in nature of substitute and the underlying bill. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 4601? Ranking Member Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a
Text was
substitute.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Boss, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin's legislation seems to be the most seriously impacted by the Toxic Exposure Fund scoring problem. CBO explained that they had to assign an additional $70 million mandatory cost because of the fund's impact. That creates a serious barrier to passing this legislation. My amendment would permanently resolve that issue and the other bills on today's markup and all the future bills. It is vital to the committee's ability to operate that we resolve this situation, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. In the interest of time, I will not repeat myself again. And I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I just want to I appreciate that, you won't repeat the arguments. I'll just say and I'll just say to you that VA is putting in place plans, procedures to implement PACT, and changes to the fund would delay VA's ability to execute on those plans and could negatively affect successful implementation of the PACT Act itself. Now, I know the ranking member did not take an unfounded position that the fund was some kind of slush fund, and I think that the fact we are having this debate indicates that we're being thoughtful about how it is being used. But given that the fund is subject to appropriations, we need to ensure appropriators weigh in on this proposal. I know we've been talking about this. There is precedent for a separate fund like the Toxic Exposure Fund, such as the funding used for overseas contingency operations in the Department of Defense. To preserve access to resources for certain programs, such as the cost of taking care of toxic exposed veterans, we must set aside funding, and Congress should avoid hamstringing itself. And I know that we're going to be working together on this issue. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the Bost Amendment to the ANS to H.R. 4601? Any other member? Seeing none, the question is now on the Bost Amendment to the Levin Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 4601. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the Bost Amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
I am unable to support Congressman Levin's ANS. This legislation would authorize the Secretary, we already had a roll call, right? We just had the roll, hold on just a minute. I would ask for a recommendation, or a roll call on the last one,
On the
on the Bost Amendment.
on your Bost Amendment.
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, so there being a sufficient second, I assume, yes, I see a sufficient second. A recorded vote is ordered on the Bost Amendment nature of substitute pursuant to Committee Rule 4. Proceedings on the measure shall be postponed. We will now move to H.R. 3304. I now call up, the clerk will designate the bill H.R. 3304.
H.R. 3304 to
Text was
amend
circulated in
title.
advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Text was circulated in
33.
advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, is considered as read, and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on my amendment in the nature of a substitute. Now, I was honored to introduce this legislation with Representative Fletcher, and I offer this ANS to allow this committee to advance the bill and bring it to the floor of the House as soon as possible. Currently, disabled veterans are only allowed a single grant to modify a vehicle to provide them mobility. That means there are cars that are 25, 30, or even 40 years old on the road because the veteran has no other option. The Cars for Vets Act finally expands eligibility for disabled veterans to obtain vehicles modified for their disabilities more than once in their lifetime. The amendment in the nature of substitute immediately allows those who've waited 25 years to get a new vehicle today, and soon the benefit will allow all of those who have waited 10 years to do so to obtain a vehicle. The legislation also expands the definition of medical services to include certain vehicle modifications so that veterans can attend medical appointments. This legislation has long been a priority for veterans and is supported by DAV, VFW, PVA, and countless other veterans organizations. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss
Mr. Chairman.
the ANS to H.R. 3304? Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very supportive of your amendment in the nature of a substitute. The ANS would finally find a fiscally responsible way to provide deserving population and with safe and reliable transportation that they need. We all know that the life of a vehicle is not infinite. except for my father who just recently passed. He thought they were infinite. And then because of this, I'm real pleased to see the proposed move forward today and that this is fully offset. And I can say that the case of many of these other bills on the agenda, and I can't say that with many of the other bills on the agenda. The underlying bill is very similar to H.R. 1361, the Auto for Veterans Act, which was introduced this Congress and last Congress by our colleague, Congressman Muser. I want to thank Paralyzed Veterans of America for their continued advocacy for this additional grant for service-connected disability veterans. And I encourage all of my members to support this because it is so vitally needed. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Any further discussion on the bill? And I'm curious how old your father's vehicle was.
Well, old.
Okay, all right.
Many of them.
All right, so the question is now on the Takano Amendment and nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Takano Amendment and nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there any further debate on H.R. 3304? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that committee report H.R. 3304 as amended favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 3304 as amended.
Without objection, we will now consider H.R. 2521. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R.
Text
2521.
was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read, and I'm open to amendment at any point. I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Text was
H.R.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, is considered as read, and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on my amendments in the nature of a substitute, my amendment in the nature of a substitute. And I'll say that I'm pleased to offer an ANS to Congresswoman Lawrence's bill, H.R. 2521, the Doula for VA Act of 2021. Now, this bill requires VA conduct a feasibility and advisability study on the proposed pilot project to provide pregnant veterans with doula support services and measure the outcomes of the veterans' birth experiences, mental health, and physical well-being. The United States has a maternity mortality crisis, and our veterans are not protected from it. In fact, they are disproportionately more likely to experience severe maternal mental health outcomes than their civilian counterparts. We know that doula care can be an effective tool in mitigating pre- and postpartum mental health crises and has been proven to be a factor in reducing childbirth complications. VA must investigate its ability to provide such holistic and effective care. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in nature of substitute. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the ANS to H.R. 2521?
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Text was
H.R.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Thank you, Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, Mr. Chairman, my amendment would revert the Toxic Exposed Fund, or in the PACT Act language, back to its original version that you wrote in the House passage. It would eliminate the mandatory cost of this bill, even though your amendment is in the nature of substitute, only requires a study. CBO has identified a mandatory cost that will have an impact should the pilot go forward on VA's recommendation. My amendment would simply reinstate CBO's normal cost estimate and scoring rules. It is clear that the amendment lacks majority support today, and in the interest of time, I withdraw it.
Well, I thank you, and I accept your withdrawing the amendment. Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but unfortunately, I still can't support the bill. I cannot agree more that this is it's critical that we support women veterans throughout their pregnancies. Just in the last few years, the use of maternity services within the VA has increased 44%. This legislation would require VA to conduct a study on whether it would be feasible and advisable for the department to establish a pilot program to pair pregnant veterans with doulas. Doulas are not healthcare professionals, but do offer emotional and educational support for new mothers. However, this is currently not certifying criteria, credentialing or licensing standards. There are none for doulas in the country. This lack of standardization training for doulas gives me concern about the pilot program that would be required in the introduced version of the bill. VA shares those concerns. I thank Chairman Takano for recognizing that the work to amend the bill to ensure that we were taking a more careful and measured approach to this issue. Unfortunately, I cannot support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2521. Even though this legislation now requires a study, Cvso has estimated a mandatory cost. Without the fund fixed in place, I cannot proceed with this. Proceed to support this legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. Is there further debate on
Okay,
on the Takano ANS? If not, the question is on the Takano ANS. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And I now recognize myself. I recognize myself for a motion. I move that that H.R. 2521 as amended. 2521. I move that H.R. 2521 as amended be reported to the House, be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no.
No.
The motion is agreed to. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And that part of the thing. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Voss.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file mandatory or minority or supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 2521 as amended.
Without objection, we now will move to H.R. 7589. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 7589. Clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 7589 to amend Title 38 United States Code to prohibit the imposition or collection of co-payments for certain mental health
Text is
outpatient.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a
Text was
substitute.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and is considered as read. The first reading dispensed with is considered as read and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I am very pleased to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to my bill, H.R. 7589, the reduced and eliminate mental health outpatient veteran copays or remove copays act. This bill turns a legislative proposal from VA into a law that will make every enrolled veteran's first 3 outpatient mental health appointments at VA free every year. We know that what may seem like low copays can in fact be significant financial barriers for many veterans. Our goal is to knock down all barriers for veterans seeking and accessing high-quality, timely mental health care at VA. VA strongly supports this bill, as do many VSOs and mental health organizations. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the ANS, which does not change the intent of the original bill, but incorporates technical assistance from VA. Is there further discussion on the amendment and the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
I would like to thank Chairman Takano for introducing H.R. 7589 that removes Copays Act. Mental health care is an important part of health care, especially at VA. This bill would eliminate copays for veterans for their first 3 outpatient mental health visits per year. In doing so, it will encourage veterans to seek the needed mental health care and support to do the brave thing and reach out and ask for that help. I'm glad to support the bill today.
I thank the ranking member for his support. Is there any further debate on the Takano amendment? If not, the question is on the Takano amendment and the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7589. All those in favor will say aye. 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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment and the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 7589 as amended favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority, supplemental, additional, and dissenting views on H.R. 7589 as amended.
Without objection. That concludes, let's see. We will now move on to the unfinished business of recorded votes, which were postponed. Recorded votes were ordered on the following measures: H.R. 6273, H.R. 1957, H.R. 4601. We're going to just take a slight pause to make sure that we have all of the votes in order. All right. Pause is lifted. Recorded votes were ordered on Bost Amendment to H.R. 6273. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Bost Amendment to H.R. 6273, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee,
No.
Mr. Lamb,
No.
Mr. Levin,
No.
Mr. Pappas, Ms. Luria, Ms. Luria,
Luria votes
We
no.
all say no together.
Ms. Luria,
Luria votes no.
Mr. Mervan,
Mervan votes no.
Ms. Sheriff-List McCormick,
Sheriff-List McCormick votes no.
Where's the volume?
Mr. Sablon, Mr.
Sablon votes no.
Ms. Underwood,
Underwood votes no.
Mr. Allred, Mr. Allred, Ms. Frankel,
No.
Ms. Sotkin,
No.
Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Ms. Capter,
No.
Dr. Ruiz,
No.
Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego, Ranking Member Bost,
Yes.
Ms. Radawagon, Ms. Radawagon, Mr. Bergman, Mr. Banks, Mr. Roy,
Yes.
Mr. Mann,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Ms. Mace, Mr. Cawthorn,
Yes.
Mr. Nels,
Yes.
Mr. Rosendale,
Yes.
Dr. Miller Meeks, Dr.
Miller
Miller,
Meeks says yes.
Mr. Elzey,
Elsie, yes.
Ms. Conway, Ms. Conway, Mr. Allred, Mr. Allred, Mr. Trone, Mr. Trone, Mr. Gallego, Mr. Gallego, Ms. Radawagon, Ms. Radawagon, Ms. Conway, Ms. Conway, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Takano votes no. Are there any members who wish to change their vote? The clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 12 ayes and 14 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My motion to reconsider was left on the table. You finished that?
Yes.
Yes, so now, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I now move that H.R. 6273 be favorably reported to the House. All those in favor shall say aye.
Mr. Chairman, I do need to speak.
Ranking Member Bost.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regardless of the fact that the amendment was not adopted, I strongly believe that the bill is important. And so H.R. 6273 would build on the VA's existing suicide prevention and initiatives by establishing a zero suicide pilot at 5 VA medical centers, including one that serves veterans in rural and remote areas. And it dismays me that still not so many veterans in their own lives every day. 2020, approximately 16 veterans died by suicide every day, for a total of more than 6,000 veteran suicide deaths. This is a fight that has only been marginally won over the last several years, but every effort counts. We must continue fighting in every way possible. The Zero Suicide Pilot Program would require VA to consult with external experts and adopt a continuous quality improvement method to address suicide. It would improve training in suicide prevention strategies for VA's workforce from top to bottom, in recognition of the fact that stopping suicides requires everyone's support and dedication. The pilot would teach staff to become comfortable discussing mental health and suicide issues. Veterans are all flagged at risk of suicide and would receive a standardized assessment to determine their next course of treatment. I appreciate that Congresswoman Lee for her introducing of H.R. 6273, which could provide VA with another tool in fulfilling its suicide prevention mission. Mr. Chairman, I ask that you work with me to identify an offset that could pay for the important legislation before it goes to the floor, or commit to me that you would not advance on the bill on the floor until the cost issue is resolved. This is one exception I am willing to make in an effort to save every veteran's life possible in our fight against suicide. With your commitment, I would support the bill and would yield back if that's the case.
Well, Ranking Member Boss, I can't say that I'll commit myself to the offset, but I will commit myself to working with you on the Cvso scoring issues and finding a solution, not only for this bill, but for bills that both the minority and the majority hold as priorities.
Okay.
So I recognize you for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 6273 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
The question is now on H.R. 6273. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. And the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Boss.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6273.
And without objection, staff are organized to, or authorized to make necessary technical conforming changes. Recorded votes were ordered on the substitute amendment to the Brownlee Amendment and nature of substitute to H.R. 1957. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Boss substitute to the Brownlee Amendment and nature of substitute to H.R. 1957, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee.
This is on the Brownlee Amendment, Mr. Chairman.
This is the Boss amendment to the Brownlee ANS.
No.
Mr. Lamb.
No.
Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Pappas. Ms. Luria.
No.
Mr. Mervan.
No.
Ms. Sherflis McCormick.
No.
Mr. Sablon.
No.
Ms. Underwood.
Underwood votes no.
Mr. Allred.
No.
Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Slotkin.
No.
Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Ms. Capter.
No.
Dr. Ruiz.
No.
Mr. Gallego. Ranking Member Bost.
Yes.
Ms. Radewagen. Ms. Radewagen. General Bergman. Yes. Mr. Banks. Yes. Mr. Roy. Yes. Mr. Mann.
Yes.
Mr. Moore.
Yes.
Ms. Mace. Yes. Mr. Cawthorn.
Cawthorn, aye.
Mr. Nels.
Yes.
Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Dr. Miller Meeks.
Miller Meeks, aye.
Mr. Elzey.
Elsie, yes.
Ms. Conway. Ms. Conway? Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel? Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Radawagon? Ms. Radawagon? Ms. Conway?
Madam Clerk, how is Ms. Frankel recorded?
She's not
No,
recorded.
Frankel votes no.
Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Chairman?
Chairman Takano votes no. Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 12 ayes and 16 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Brownlee amendment in nature of a substitute to H.R. 1957. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, we request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Is there a sufficient second? Yes, there is. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Brownlee amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1957. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee?
Aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Lamb? Mr. Lamb? Aye. Mr. Lamb votes aye. Mr. Levin?
Aye.
Mr. Levin votes aye. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Luria?
Aye.
Ms. Luria votes aye. Mr. Mervan? Mr. Mervan? Ms. Sheriff Lewis McCormick?
Aye.
Ms. Sheriff Lewis McCormick votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
Aye.
Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Underwood?
Underwood votes aye.
Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mr. Allred?
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Ms. Frankel?
Aye.
Ms. Frankel votes aye. Ms. Slotkin?
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter votes aye. Dr. Ruiz?
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Ranking Member Bost?
No.
Ranking Member Bost votes no. Ms. Radawagon? Ms. Radawagon? General Bergman? No. General Bergman votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Roy?
No.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Mann?
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moore?
No.
Mr. Moore votes no. Ms. Mace? Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Cawthorn? Mr. Cawthorn votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, no.
Mr. Rosendale votes no. Dr. Miller Meeks? Dr. Miller Meeks? Mr. Elzey?
Elsie, no.
Mr. Elzey votes no. Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Mervan?
Mr. Mervan votes yes.
Mr. Mervan votes yes. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Radawagon? Ms. Radawagon? Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Dr. Miller Meeks? Dr. Miller Meeks? Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Chairman?
Chairman Takano votes yes. Are there any members who wish to change their votes? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 16 ayes and 10 noes.
Mr. Chairman, it's Lauren Underwood. May I be recognized?
Ms. Underwood?
Can you instruct the staff to update the slide with what item we're voting on next?
Yes.
Thank you.
The Brownlee amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make necessary, I now move that HR 1975 as amended. Let me say that. I now move that HR 1957 as amended be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor shall say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make necessary and conforming changes, technical changes. The minority, all right. I'm going to extend, I realize this is an important issue for you to be recorded, and so I will extend the courtesy. The clerk will, the question now occurs on the motion to favorably report HR 1957 as amended to the floor of the House. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee?
Aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Lamb?
Yes.
Mr. Lamb votes aye. Mr. Levin?
Aye.
Mr. Levin votes aye. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes aye. Ms. Luria?
Aye.
Ms. Luria votes aye. Mr. Mervan?
Mervan votes yes.
Mervan votes yes. Ms. Sheriff Lewis McCormick?
Sheriff Lewis McCormick votes aye.
Ms. Sheriff Lewis McCormick votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
Sablon votes aye.
Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Underwood?
Underwood votes aye.
Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mr. Allred?
Aye.
Mr. Allred votes aye. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel? Ms. Slotkin?
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter votes aye. Dr. Ruiz?
Aye.
Dr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Ranking Member Bost?
No.
Ranking Member Bost votes no. Ms. Radewagen? Ms. Radewagen? Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Oh, General Bergman? Sorry. General Bergman votes no. Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Mann?
No.
Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moore?
No.
Mr. Moore votes no. Ms. Mace? Ms. Mace votes no. Mr. Cawthorn?
Cawthorn votes no.
Mr. Cawthorn votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, no.
Mr. Rosendale votes no. Dr. Miller Meeks? Dr. Miller Meeks? Mr. Elzey?
Elzey, no.
Mr. Elzey votes no. Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel?
Ms. Frankel?
Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Radewagen?
You
Madam-
missed it?
Madam Clerk, how is Ms.
Oh.
Frankel recorded?
Ms. Frankel is not recorded.
Ms. Frankel, how do you wish to vote?
Frankel votes yes.
Ms. Frankel votes aye. Ms. Radewagen? Ms. Radewagen? Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Dr. Miller Meeks? Dr. Miller Meeks? Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Chairman?
Chairman votes aye. Are there any members who wish to change their votes? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 16 ayes and 10 noes.
The motion is therefore agreed to, and the bill as amended is ordered reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 1957. Is that as amended? As amended.
Without objection. Recorded votes were ordered on the Bost amendment to the Levin amendment and nature of substitute to H.R. 4601. The question now occurs on agreeing to the Bost amendment to the Levin amendment and nature of substitute to H.R. 4601, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk shall call the roll.
Ms. Brownlee?
No.
Mr. Lamb?
No.
Mr. Lamb votes no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes no. Ms. Luria?
No.
Ms. Luria votes no. Mr. Mervan?
Mervan votes no.
Mr. Mervan votes no. Ms. Sheriff Lewis McCormick?
Sheriff Lewis McCormick votes no.
Sheriff Lewis McCormick votes no. Mr. Sablon?
Sablon votes no.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Underwood?
Underwood votes no.
Ms. Underwood votes no. Mr. Allred?
No.
Mr. Allred votes no. Ms. Frankel?
No.
Ms. Frankel votes no. Ms. Slotkin?
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter?
No.
Ms. Capter votes no. Dr. Ruiz?
No.
Dr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes no. Ranking Member Bost?
Yes.
Ranking Member Bost votes yes. Ms. Radewagen? Ms. Radewagen? General Bergman? Yes. General Bergman votes yes. Mr. Banks?
Okay.
Mr. Banks? Mr. Roy? Yes. Mr. Roy votes yes. Mr. Mann?
Yes.
Mr. Mann votes yes. Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Moore votes yes. Ms. Mace? Yes. Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Cawthorn? Mr. Cawthorn votes yes. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Dr. Miller-Meeks? Dr. Miller-Meeks? Mr. Elzey?
Elzey, aye.
Mr. Elzey votes aye. Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Radewagen? Ms. Radewagen? Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks? Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels? Dr. Miller-Meeks? Dr. Miller-Meeks? Ms. Conway? Ms. Conway? Mr. Chairman?
Chairman votes no. Are there any members who wish to change their votes? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 9 ayes and 16 noes.
The amendment is therefore not agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I understand that Ranking Member Bost would like to be recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm unable to support Congressman Levin's ANS. This legislation would authorize Secretary to award grants to state Indian tribes to improve outreach and assistance to veterans on VA benefits. Under the bill, the VA would prioritize grants based on the areas that have a large population of underserved veterans and high rates of suicide. I support the intent of the bill, and I support bolstering the efforts of county and tribal VSOs who help veterans with their claims. Oftentimes, the VSOs may be the only accredited representation that the rural and remote veterans have access to. In light of the massive expansion of health care and disability benefits under the PACT Act, it is critical that the county and tribal VSOs have the tools they need to assist our veterans. However, I cannot support the ANS because the majority solution to the problem created by the Toxic Exposed Fund is unacceptable. Rather than solve the underlying problem, the ANS exempts the grant program from the Toxic Exposure Fund in order to make the mandatory score go away. If we exempt every program and pieces of legislation that is impacted by the Toxic Exposed Fund in this way, we will create an unmanageable mess. 2 weeks ago, the VA provided its initial plan for how the additional fund-backed act would be used to expand health care and benefits. VA noted that it is already very difficult to track when programs will be paid for by the Toxic Exposed Fund as opposed to the regular budget. For example, VA quoted, "It is not economically or operationally justifiable to parse disability compensation claim conditions to different examiners based on how they are funded," end quote. It would be irresponsible for the committee to create another layer of complication by creating piecemeal exemptions to the fund. Instead, we need to fix the problem once and for all by passing a solution like the amendment that I offered. As I said earlier, while I support the intent of the bill, I cannot support the proposals we have before us today. I urge my colleagues to oppose the ANS, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Boss. The question is now, the question now occurs on agreeing to the Levin Amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4601. Again, the question now occurs on agreeing to the Levin Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4601. All those in favor will say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed will say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of an agreement, nature of a substitute by Representative Levin is agreed to. I now move that H.R. 4601 as amended be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The motion, without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Boss.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, and dissenting views on H.R. 4601 as amended.
Without objection. Well, this concludes the business of the markup. Does the ranking member or any other member wish to be recognized before we adjourn?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the efforts of the members here today. I know it's been tough trying to hold in here for both sides of the aisle as work is going on all over the Capitol, but I look forward to considering some of these bills on the House floor. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask for your help in trying to find a way forward on all the numerous bills that are pending in the U.S. Senate. It is the majority's job in both chambers to work with all parties to put together a strategy to pass the legislation we have pending into law. We still do not seem to have a plan for passing a year-end package of bills. Our committee and the Senate VA committee have been discussing this package for almost a year, and the time is running out. Passing bills out of this committee and the House does not get them to the President's desk. I look forward to working with the Chairman and others to address these situations before the end of Congress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, I thank the ranking member for his comments. I will say, while we technically have a majority in the Senate, the ranking member knows very much as well as I do the rather special rules that the Senate has, and I agree with you. We have many bills on both sides of the aisle by our members, by majority and minority members, which deserve to get to the desk of the President. We've already passed them, and the Senate merely needs to act on them. We need to work with our colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the Senate so that we get past the very special rules that they have in the Senate. So with that, I want to thank all members for their attendance and participation, and this meeting is now adjourned.